Buffalo, New York at that time was like a lot of cities that were up and coming. You know, many African Americans migrated here from the South in search of better job opportunities. You know, Bethlehem and Republic Steel immediately come to mind, where many people found employment. Also, you know, for recreation, Buffalo was one of the premier hotspots of the country.
We were a closely knitted group. Population was a lot smaller. The main area, our main community was William Street. That was the major black business district.
You cannot imagine what William Street was. The clubs, black people could go out and just be on William Street. They didn't have to go nowhere else, just right on William Street. I'm telling you, the place was popping. It was burning. It was a hot city like that. So, you know, the record stores, had to be blazing. They were blazing, So I'm into all that.
Many talk about William Street, but another thoroughfare, which in an area that's talked about and romanticized to this day, is Jefferson Avenue.
Cold Spring was very unique in that you really didn't have to go downtown to do any shopping. You had more than adequate shopping right on Jefferson Avenue. There was a lot of businesses all the way door to door, all the way down past South Division on Jefferson Avenue. Really, you didn't have to go downtown to buy anything that you thought you might need. So, like I said, Jefferson Avenue was the heart and soul of the community for a long time.
I have memories of Jefferson being so alive and so vibrant, and so many businesses and so many things going on. The same thing with William Street. You can walk from one end of William all the way down to Michigan, and from William and Jefferson all the way down to Ferry, and it was just alive with activity and people doing so many different things.
I'm very, very proud to have won. And I think it's a victory for the people of 143rd District. I owe a great deed of gratitude to my wife, who worked with me so very closely during these trying months. And to the many thousands of mothers who helped us in this campaign, and to my campaign chairman, Jim Bryant. We look to go forward to a good campaign, because there are things evidently that people are concerned about in the 143rd, and they want to see things happen.
Just very grateful to the Parks Commissioner and to the Mayor of the city for their cooperation in helping us to secure funds for the erection and purchase of property for a necessary playground in the Maston District. As you well know, our district, with one of the largest populations between the ages of 3 and 18, has only one playground. A good example is here at School 39, with a capacity of 600 pupils, which now is overrun with 1,100 boys and girls. Classes are being held in the halls. There is a great need now, immediately, for additional classroom facilities. In addition to this, however, when these boys are dismissed and during summer vacation, there is no adequate play facility in this area. The Maston District must have, now, a playground facility.
While we were a small community, there were a lot of things that were going on, but there was also a lot of frustration among the youth, and then there was a problem that we were having with the schools. And we were talking about, the lack of a quality education for our youth, and things of that nature that was there, until it was a community that was on edge.
The people at the time were complaining about being lied to
promises being made to them that were never kept, dealing with poverty and jobs, dealing with houses that were dilapidated, and the city actually paying money to develop other parts of the town. We know that the Schenectady Expressway construction disrupted the black people that were coming into the city who were trying to find houses over there. You know what I mean? The Jewish people that were living there, they ended up moving out. Part of the reason because they knew that the demolition was coming. Part of the reason because they knew that the houses, the foundations along that Schenectady Expressway would be diminished. So the Jewish flight in that area also contributed to the tensions in the area.
You were hoping that it wouldn't happen here. It was a city that, in a community that was waiting for something to happen. There was a lot of frustration that was building up.
These kids right here don't have no childhood. A man child as soon as they're born. You know, no childhood at all. They grow up the minute they hit the ground, you know, hit the earth. They grow up. The minute they get into the world.
Yeah, see a whole lot of problems.
Like what?
Look at like nasty living. Look at this place right here. We need
now.
to clean up grass.
I tell you a problem now. Ain't no place around here to go, and not trying to be funny or nothing, but a couple of people around here don't like y'all standing down here taking all this.
It was a thing of waiting to see when Buffalo was going to have their day in the news. There were riots going on throughout the country, different cities and what have you. And I think there are people out in the streets who wanted the excitement of a riot. And I think the other part of that, too, was that there were policemen who wanted the excitement of riots, and maybe even some politicians, because one of the things that happened with the riot, then they could apply to the federal government for funding, and that funding could be used for a number of different things. So it wasn't just the frustrations of black people because they didn't have jobs. That's nothing new in America. It was many wanted to see themselves on television. They want to be in the news. So, you know, it's that kind of a thing.
Well, most of the kids around here, they've been promised jobs for the longest, and they're getting sick of getting promises. They haven't got no jobs yet, and they're getting sick of it. And they told these junkies and these pushers out down here to get out and down here. A couple of them still hanging around, so a couple of them got shot. Now they pulling up.
Are you taking responsibility for trying to get some of the junkies and the pushers out of the area?
Yeah.
You are?
Ain't nobody else around here doing nothing about it. Police ain't doing nothing. Grown-ups sit around here and say that they doing this and doing that, and they ain't doing nothing, so somebody got to do it.
But they claim that they've received little encouragement or help from the establishment, and they're getting impatient. As one youth told me, this is the last meeting I'm ever going to. I'm not talking anymore.
The youth of Buffalo were dissatisfied. They wanted change. They felt that the adults were not listening, and this was their way of getting the attention of the public. And also, you know, you have to remember this is in the 1960s, so Buffalo, like everywhere else, you know, you're under the backdrop of not just the civil rights movement, but also the Black Power movement that's slowly beginning to come into play. Black power, power to the people. And sometimes there the method to it might not have always been the best method, but it certainly achieved one goal, and that was to get the attention of the public by any means necessary. And it all came to a head one fateful night on June 26, 1967, at the corner of Sycamore and Gray Street.
The riot started on this corner here, right here, on Gray and Sycamore. Gray and Sycamore. At this corner, there was the bar, Lee's. Across the street, the store. There were a group of young men standing at this corner, And they were speaking of the rights that were being deprived of the black people in this area and other areas of the city. It escalated. It began to escalate. And someone picked up a brick and threw it at a passing bus. At that point, the bus stopped. The people were dragged out of the bus, and it got wilder and more unruly as it escalated. The riot left from this area, went down to Adams and Sycamore, where there was a Be Quick store. A brick was thrown in that window, and the people began to enter into it and loot the store. After a period of time, I don't even remember how long it took, the police came in riot gear and released the dogs. And the very next day, rumors were spread that there was machine guns mounted on Stransky's, which was a plumbing place.
In the summer of 1967, the black ghetto of Buffalo, New York, like so many others around the country that year, erupted in violent rebellion. Storefronts and houses were looted and burned, and business in the Cold Springs ghetto came to a virtual standstill.
As I was working at WBLK at the time, George Lorenz asked me to go down and to report back to the studio via telephone what was going on in the community. So I got down there, and the first person I run into was Jimmy Hunter. Jimmy Hunter was at the time, he was a police officer, but he was with the motorcycle division. And Jimmy knew my father very well. My father was still with the police department, although he was working out of headquarters at the time. But Jimmy knew me from a child. And first thing Jimmy said to me was, what are you doing down here? So I told him, I said, the station sent me down to report on what was going on. He said, well, you're a DJ. You're not a journalist. So he said, I would advise you to get out of here because we're clearing the streets. And at the time, there was numerous Buffalo police officers patrolling the street, and they all had shotguns, and they were carrying them with the butt of the shotgun on their hip, and they were walking up and down the street and just basically clearing the street and getting people out of there.
My partner was a white guy, and I was at probably about 1:30 in the morning at that time, and we were at Sycamore and right near Jefferson, and probably right in front of the Build organization headquarters at that point. Just as we pulled up and was getting ready, just as we got in front of the place, I'd say, there was just one guy who took a brick or something, whatever, and threw and knocked out a plate glass window in this building. And I mean, he had to have seen us. We were right there. So he did it on purpose. We got out to find out what was going on, and suddenly we found ourselves surrounded by people. But I recognized a lot of those people. They were not trying to do us any harm. They were just trying to keep us from locking the guy up. And these individuals were older people, and they were members of the Build organization. And so for a minute, I'm stuck. I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. We couldn't think of what was going on. So I had a hold of the guy who broke the window, and they were tugging on him, and they won the battle, and I lost it. So the guy runs away, and I end up with a sore shoulder. And then everyone disappeared. That is until the following day or evening. And on that same corner and everything, young people gathered, and they were throwing rocks at buses and cars and what have you. So Build organization was started by a guy called Sal Malinsky. And it was an organization put together to sort of like be a watchdog for poor people, and to be a intermediary into problems that people have, to get their just due, and primarily blacks. So they had different ways of doing it. They would advocate boycotts. They could hang sheets out the windows, to get a message across. Those kinds of things. But it had a good reputation. The people, you had some good people involved in it. People like Bill Gator and some others. They were made up primarily of older individuals, not young people that you would see out in the street riot, because that wasn't their thing.
Bill had opened an office on Sycamore, a few doors east of Jefferson. I was in the Build office, and I came outside for something, and there was a convertible car parked on, I think it's Adams Street, I'm not sure. Anyway, the car was just outside the office. I looked over, and there was a fellow with paper in his hand and a match. He was striking, and it wasn't working. I said, would you mind not doing that? He ignored me, kept going. Finally got it lit and threw it in the car. Later, the cops came along, and they were almost like an invading army. They blockaded the intersection of Jefferson and told everybody to get off the street, get off. They chased people from their own front porch rather than try. Bill was trying to help keep order. Cops weren't having any part of it. One of them with a mask and a shotgun. I walked up near the corner of Jefferson and Sycamore, and he went, mm-hmm. I said, what did you say? Mm-hmm. I said, I don't understand you. He took his mask off and said, if you don't move now, you never will. That was his reaction to somebody trying to help maintain order.
Why you have to do that? Hear my stuff, I got everything. I mean, why y'all have to ram hustle me? Wait a minute, hear my stuff, I got everything you want. Wait a minute, just a minute. I mean, I have my rights, and you all don't. Oh, you got a shotgun, now you can tell me what to do, huh? It's about the idea. It's my son-in-law, Percy Eldridge. I got everything in it. Oh, you're just gonna stop me just because you got a shotgun. Get in the car and get going. Don't point no gun at me. Don't point no shotgun at me. I know my rights. Put no shit. Who's driving this car? My son-in-law, Percy Eldridge. You sit down there, you get back in your seat. Well, just a minute, wait a minute. I'm asking you now to get in the car. I'll open the door for you. Now get in the car. You want to get in the car? Nobody wants to hit you. Get in the car. Get in the car. I'm giving you a chance to get in the car. I'm asking you to get in the car. Move. Well, if you was on a uniform, if you was on a uniform, yes, sir. If you was on a uniform, right, boy, you'd be it. I am it, sir.
We have the greatest relations in the world, which we have had ever since. That's on camera. All right, good. We've had good relations. We've had a few troublemakers around, a few agitators. And if a leader gets up and he screams about police brutality, he gets an audience. This is what they want to hear. They might. Why? Chief? I don't know. What's more rough? Chief, what? Somebody. Yeah, we better get out of here.
Night. Am I doing something wrong? Oh! Everybody off the street. Let's go. These guys are talking to me like this.
Hey, I know you. Just tell you to move. Everybody's moving. That's all.
Is there a curfew or something? What?
Oh, but there's no loud either.
Oh, I didn't do nothing. I was walking, wasn't I? I was moving on. So what did I do wrong?
Stay right there. Huh? Just being here is enough.
Can I go home?
You ain't going home. You're under arrest.
Okay.
Well, I can remember that was a year that I graduated from high school, and I remember the night we graduated from high school, we had all our tuxes on, And we came down Jefferson and turned at the corner of Ferry, and there were some tanks there. And the soldiers got out and lined us up against the wall, even though we were in tuxedos and that, and more or less harassed us, told us that we were rioting and doing certain things where, I mean, it was apparent that we were coming from a prom or graduation, I should say. And I remember lining us up, and they hit a number of us in the back with guns, and a couple guys went down. And I think I was fortunate. I was one of the last ones that they just told us to get out of here and go riot somewhere else.
Cop cars back in those days that were, telling folks get off the corner, because, brothers back in those days used to loiter on corners, and become walking gazettes of information. And so I see things that, confrontation between the gangs and the police. I saw those kind of events. I saw also police brutality, whereby, kids who are coming from the side streets to Jefferson, they wanted to see what the fire's about. And they hear fire engines and, police sirens. So, that attracts young kids to come to see what's happening, And so when these things happen and the police is telling, the children to go back home or get off the street, then there would be these little altercations where you would have stubborn folks who say, no, I ain't going nowhere. So I saw girls being dragged down the street by the legs by the police with the dresses, over their heads, kind of ugly kinds of things, See a lot of tear gas, it's almost like a typical riot that you see that police are involved in when they want to stop, the crowd, and so they would be shooting tear gas. So I can remember further down Jefferson, because the riot was way down Jefferson, toward the projects, and there was riots around that area too. So it was almost like a spontaneous combustion based on those things that were happening in other cities.
I saw policemen looting. No offense, but there were police. That may surprise you. It may surprise them. It didn't surprise me. There was like police were pretty good looters. Prior to the riots, if some popular business was burglarized and you got a phone call, someone called in and turned it in, and the police would respond, and the burglars would probably disappear, and about a lot more police cars would show up at that scene than necessary, and a lot of things would be missing that the person fleeing could not have carried. The night of the so-called riot, let's give you an example, I saw police officers taking heavy stuff out of stores and put it in their vehicles. And at one point I said to the deputy, look at that policeman. And the captain, they turned and looked the opposite direction. I said, you see him? We don't see nothing. But that was normal for police officers.
Come on now. Go down for the street.
Get off at Jefferson or we'll use gas.
And you shoot gas.
Our whole thing was, how do we stop it? How do we bring about, into this and let's, get everybody together and see what we could do to resolve some of the issues. And the issue, youth employment and things of this nature. So we had to hit the street. We hit the streets and walked the streets to try to talk to some of the youngsters and the others there to say, hey, this is not going to get the issue, it brought the issue of this is not going to, help if we destroy them because we're only hurting ourselves. Let's get together, let's start being, and we did have some series of meetings at Westminster House and in other places in order to try to resolve the problems. And it's the whole thing of, look, we want this and you got to do, you're an elected official, you're supposed to be this and you're supposed, let's get out and do it. You're the pastor of the church and the ministers and the others, we need to have this, and this, and let's have a real conversation and get some returns from government for what we need for our community so that we can have the education that our kids should have. We can get the summer jobs and employment for other individuals who want it.
We are not like Schreiber, who makes a statement that if he'd had a poverty grant, he said this before a U.S. Senate committee, he had a poverty grant in Watts, that Watts never would have rioted. This is what we call a zookeeper mentality. This is the kind of white mentality that looks upon Negroes as animals in a zoo, and the whole point is to keep them quiet. This is the kind of mentality that commissions on human relations eke out their livings on. Because if you read their reports every year, they always run the same way. The Negroes are getting whiter and whiter every year, more and more middle class, and if there was no riot, it was because they were around, and if there was a riot, it would have been worse if they hadn't been around. It's a heads I win, tails you lose proposition. Now hold it for a minute. We are not for violence. Well, now let me come back to Schreiber for a moment on this mentality business. The important thing in Watts, instantly the question that anyone who's at all sophisticated on the problem that they had about Watts was not why did Watts riot in 65, but why it didn't in 64 and in 63 and in 62. If you knew the conditions down there, and you saw all of these injustices just compounded and heaped upon each other, the fact is that this is the job to be done, and riots become incidental on the thing. The important thing is to correct these conditions and not to just put in some kind of a move like throwing bones to animals to keep them quiet on it.
And Governor Rockefeller called out the troops to put down the riot. He also sent to Buffalo the baseball great Jackie Robinson to see if Jackie Robinson, he made him an assistant to urban affairs to see if he could intervene.
We are asking for 3,000 jobs from the private sector, and this is not going to be a 2 or 3 month proposition. It's going to be on a permanent basis. We're all concerned with this, the CAO, the government, the state. Mr. Lugar has offered some good help. Mr. Robinson has offered some good advice, and together I am sure that the main source of trouble here, or at least one of the causes, not the sole cause, one of the causes, the lack of jobs, that jobs will be forthcoming, that we will get them, and we will work together towards a better city.
We are sincerely saying that the governor is dedicated to this. He's been brought up to date out in Wyoming as to what is happening here, and I think the governor's interest is showing the kind of sincerity that is needed and necessary here, and we're going to implement everything we possibly have said here and follow through on it, and we're just going to ask, as the mayor asked, that just a little bit of time be given to prove our sincerity.
And this goes back when I was on the Board of Supervisors. I had sponsored a resolution to establish the drug rehab center that we used to have on Best Street, 450 Best Street. Jackie was the governor's guy who he sent in to do. So Jackie and I had that relationship and the others. So when he came in for the riot, it was a degree of suspect because of him and his association with Rockefeller and the Republican establishment, and could he really deliver it? So people respected him, they turned out for him. It was a good meeting, a good rally. There was a lot of people there. A lot of people got a chance to get a lot of frustration off the chest and bang and the accuse and do things that they do. And so he listened and all the rest of it, but there wasn't that much follow through after that.
I don't think he was effective at all. He might have met with some leaders. I'm sure he met with the mayor. I know he met with Mayor Sedita at the time, and he met with other community leaders. But the anger was such that, people really could not relate to him, and a lot of leaders at that particular time. And I think it's true today, especially when it comes to our young people. I don't think they relate to a lot of the people who are in leadership. I know the leadership is reaching out to them, but at the same time, there's this communication gap. They don't see eye to eye. There's this generational gap, and I think that some of that existed during that time.
Very few people, young folks, very few knew who the heck Jackie Robinson was. Older people, yeah, 1949 or 8 or something like that, Jackie Robinson broke the color line in white national baseball. But young people didn't know anything about him. So I personally, I just thought they brought the wrong guy in if they wanted one to communicate with the average age of the individual that was out there in the street.
I had a couple of visits, one from the FBI and one from the, I don't think they were state police that come in and looked over the literature and asked me how come. I said, "You're looking for trouble. Why do you want to sell this type of stuff?" I said, "Because I have a constitutional right to sell this kind of stuff." He said, "Well, you can get better stuff to sell than this communist stuff." I said, "Look, I have a constitutional right to sell this, and nobody determines what type of books I sell." He said, "Well, if you're looking for trouble, it's all right with you," and they walked out.
Martin Sostre arrived in Buffalo, New York shortly after doing time in Attica Prison. He found work at Bethlehem Steel and in 1965 opened up the Afro-Asian bookstore, which had 3 locations on Buffalo's east side. It sold anti-war literature, black nationalist literature, also jazz records, as well as African artifacts. During the disturbance, the Afro-Asian bookstore had the distinction of being the only store on Jefferson Avenue that many of the residents and some of the youth in the area found refuge from the police and tear gas inside the Afro-Asian bookstore.
He actually was the first person to own an African bookstore in the city of Buffalo, and I don't think we've given him proper credit for doing that. Of course, since then we've had Harambe, and then now we have Zawadi, owned by Sharon and Kenny Holly, very prominent leaders in our community. But he was the one that started it. And just about every kind of book related to the political scene when it came to African Americans, related to prisoners' rights, related to nationalism, related to the black Muslim community, because during that time, in the 60s, 65, 66, and so on, you had a very vibrant Muslim community in the city of Buffalo, black Muslim community.
His bookstore was a place where I first heard about Naim Akbar. His bookstore was the first place I heard about Ivan Van Sertima. His bookstore was a place where my eyes and mind were further opened to my history and my culture. That already started, and the presence of the bookstore in our community is something that expanded my knowledge and expanded my further understanding of who I was as a black person, as an African woman, and as a black person needing a place like that, which was so refreshing because of the music and the books and the personality of who I thought was a wonderful man.
It might have been about 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and it was on the weekend, and I closed the store on Orange Street and went to the one on Jefferson Woodline. So when he closed up, we could have went home together. And instead of us going home together that night, the police brushed in on us and roughed us up like it was just unbelievable. And I didn't even know what was going on. And when they took us downtown, I didn't even know what was going on then until maybe even the next day.
In an effort to find a scapegoat for the disturbance, the local authorities had arrested Martin Sostre on the charges of selling narcotics. And he was quickly portrayed not only by the local authorities, but also the local media as being the so-called mastermind of the '67 disturbance. He would be convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to 41 years in jail.
I don't think he was the fall guy myself. I think it was a whole litany of things that brought about the civil disorder. And one person wasn't able to do all that, and he certainly was. But he was the target.
Later in the summer of 1967, Buffalo Police Commissioner Frank Filacetta went to Washington, D.C. to testify before a Senate Internal Security Subcommittee the charges against Martin Sostre. In his charges, he stated that during a raid on Sostre's home, they uncovered Molotov cocktails and other equipment which would be used to incite a riot. The charges were unsubstantiated. However, they had come out in the media right before the grand jury was supposed to consider indictment. Now, eventually, since the charges were unsubstantiated, the riot incitement and the subversive activity charges were dropped. However, the drug charges remained.
The motion for a new trial for Martin Sostre depends on the testimony of convicted felon Arto Williams. In 1968, he testified that in '67, under police surveillance, he had purchased heroin from Martin Sostre. That sent Sostre up for 30 to 40 years. Today, he's had a change of heart and a change of testimony. Now he says it was all a frame-up on his part so that he could get out of jail. In an exclusive interview with us, he told us his story as he's now telling it.
As I try to convey to the court that when I entered Martin Sostre's bookstore, that I did have drugs on my person, and I never bought any drugs from him. And
how did you fool the police into believing you had bought drugs?
By pretending to reach across the counter. And
Arto Williams filed an affidavit in April 1971, recanting his original testimony. In that affidavit, he wrote, quote, "I gave Sostre the money, and I asked him to keep it for me. I had, on an earlier occasion, asked Sostre to keep a suit for me when I went to New York, fearing it might be stolen. He took the money, and I brought my hand up to my pocket, as if to put something in it. The plainclothesman was outside, at least 15 feet from where I was standing. The bag of drugs I had brought from the car was about 1 inch long and 3/4 of an inch wide. I never took it out of my pocket, and I believe he could not have seen it if I had."
Exactly and briefly, what did you see the night of the alleged drug buy in terms of that drug buy itself?
I saw Mr. Sostre pass Mr. Williams the glassine envelope.
In court today, it was pointed out that in your original affidavit, you hadn't mentioned seeing a glassine envelope. I wonder why.
If you read the rest of the affidavit, it would be pointed out that it was
wasn't necessary to even indicate that there was a pricing item.
There were only 2 eyewitnesses to the alleged drug transaction. Trooper Louis Steverson, whose original affidavit never mentioned the glassine envelope being passed, and John Wilcox, a New York State Police photographer, who testified in Martin's original trial that he had conducted surveillance of the bookstore from a dentist's window across the street. When asked to provide pictures of the transaction at Martin's trial, Wilcox stated that he had forgotten to load film in his camera. Nevertheless, he testified that he was able to observe through his camera at a distance of 80 feet a 1 7/8 by 7/8 inch glassine envelope being passed from Martin Sostre to Arto Williams.
According to his statement, for a while, he had got rid of his habit. He worked at Tom Est, which was a narcotic rehabilitation center. He confessed of what he did here under the pressure of the heroin addict and the prison and whatnot. And in one of those sessions, somebody suggested that he make amends. He says, "Man, you framed the man. We understand because all of them are addicts, ex-addicts. We understand the pressure, but now that you're out of that pressure, what about that man's life? 40 years is equivalent to a lifetime, his age, his business and everything. Or now that you've realized what you've done, what are you going to do?" So I guess he said, "What can I do?" And they said, "Well, why don't you try to tell the truth this time?"
Yes, when Alvin Gristmacher, Sergeant Gristmacher picked me up, I was under the influence. I had shot quite a bit of drugs that night, and he was also aware that I was under the influence. I don't know if he was aware that I was setting Martin Sostre up or not. My impression, he didn't care, he just wanted to get him. And I never knew Martin Sostre sell drugs, and first time I heard about it is when I talked to Gristmacher.
What did Chief Emeka tell you when he met you in the Buffalo police station? He made a remark about getting Sostre?
Yes, he says, we want Sostre, that you're willing to cooperate with us. We'll help you with this case.
And he told you you'd be out of jail the next day?
Oh, definitely, so guaranteed.
After having his appeal denied in 1974, he would be granted clemency in 1975 by newly elected Governor Hugh Carey, and by 1976, he would eventually be released from prison.
Yes, there were some people who came in and was saying, but to a certain degree, it was really, no, it was just a lot of frustration. A lot of frustration, the kids was in. And you reach a boiling point and you see what's happening in other cities. And you say, well, they're getting some results, or are they getting, or you believe that they're getting some results. And so what happened here, we need to do the same thing. Let's get together. And it takes just one incident, to spark it, and it grows. And that's what happened here.
Children will ask you, why? Why is it when we look out here we see nothing? You'd be surprised how hard people work to see to it that there would be nothing. Okay? You look at Jefferson and buildings that weren't burnt by the so-called riot. They supposed to have a big riot here. It wasn't that big. They burnt 2 or 3 places, that's all. And the other particular people who own the places, they set them buildings on fire or had them tore down as spite towards black people. No, this is a fact. They did this after they had been in the neighborhood and made millions of dollars for years. They did that. That's what they did to us. And some of them did it because they didn't want, there's still some of the land that's sitting out there right now. They won't let nobody build nothing on it. That's why you don't see nothing. But the people that own the land don't want to see the place built back up again. And Jefferson was the center. Not downtown Buffalo, and it was busy as son of a gun. But Jefferson was where all the ethnicity took place among us. People used to come from miles. Jefferson and Williams.
Yeah,
they even called it Bronstown. People came from miles away to come here. And we had clubs, people in there playing the latest music. the down music. People would come from out of Toronto and from Jamestown, come here to Buffalo. Buffalo was a musical mecca. It didn't just become that in the 70s. It was that back there in the 30s.
I don't call it a riot. Some people call it a riot, but I don't call it a riot. Watts in Los Angeles had a riot. Detroit had a riot. Cleveland had a riot. Harlem had a riot. There were riots in other places, but what happened in Buffalo was basically a civil disturbance. You had a few people running up and down the street and making a lot of noise, and a few windows were broken out.
It may not have been on the same level as far as, because those are bigger cities than Buffalo. But I feel like the same type of, the same feeling came across all communities, big or small. The same feeling was, we are as a people are tired. We want to see change. We want to be treated better. We're tired of the police brutality. And it just didn't, it just was ongoing. So I felt like, something had to get done. And that was it. That's what started it, the rioting, the dissatisfaction with the treatment.
I think really the police did a pretty good job. I don't think they didn't kill anybody. The one cop that was shot by another cop. And I mean, there were some blacks who were shot with buckshot running away, yeah, but they didn't die or anything, But the cop that was shot in the stomach. And he had a big belly. And so he was shot with a shotgun. And the big belly saved him because the pellets got lodged in his big fat, in the fat of his belly. So we didn't lose anybody. And the cost wasn't that great. A couple $1 million, I guess, if that much. I forgot exactly how much. But all in all, it wasn't, the police, I'd say, did a good job.
Buffalo riots in the 1960s, the late 1960s, still have an impact on, especially Jefferson Avenue today, because when Jackie Robinson came, they tried to come up with some solutions to the problems that the young people were talking about. And the one thing they talked about is jobs. We need to create jobs for these young people, and we need to create programs. And it seems like that same thought process is still today.
Well, as far as the businesses were concerned, that was never fully resolved. The narrative of Jefferson Avenue has always been that Jefferson Avenue was this bustling area of businesses and economic development, and then the riots came along and destroyed it.
Because those businesses were, firebombed in some cases, and the storefronts were destroyed and all of that, it seemed they never came back.
Many of those businesses that existed back in the day, most of them were white owned.
They got scared. They got scared and left. The few black businesses stayed out there, but they didn't pump them the money in. The tops today on Jefferson is where the A&P was. Now, A&P went out all over, but that A&P that used to be there, they did a world of business.
As you moved into the 1970s, you did have more of a proliferation of black-owned businesses, and there were some white-owned businesses that were taken over by African Americans. The Apollo Theater was one example, but there were many others. As a matter of fact, you had an organization called the Black Development Foundation that was instrumental in pre-screening loans put in by African Americans to the SBA. Now, in terms of the longevity of some of those businesses, that was somewhat touch and go. Some lasted, some didn't. And, many of the buildings and the facades are still existing on Jefferson Avenue. They're all owned by the city. to this day.
What they wanted to do was to have blacks go to the Thruway Mall or go out to Main Street, go someplace. They didn't want to build in it because they also had a problem, and one of the problems was that the theft rate was a little bit higher in the black community than it was elsewhere. But there were steps that could have been taken, to lessen that amount, and because that happens in any store, in any neighborhood. But they use that as an excuse to close the markets here.
Now, currently, the biggest thing that we have to be concerned about on Jefferson Avenue now, as well as other aspects of the African American community, is the issue of gentrification.
Part of the reason that those things were allowed to sit like they were is called demolition by neglect, because we still see, I think we just had the Buffalo Billions here in the city, right? That money could have gone to develop East Buffalo. We still see some of the effects of the 67 riots to this day that could have been fixed, that are not. So, I'm not sure what we do, but we have to focus on the details and these type of things.
Gentrification is currently going on in the Cold Spring area. It's also going on very heavily in the Fruit Belt. And the biggest problem is, as far as I can see, planning. Buffalo has had a problem with planning since time immemorial. The day the 33 Expressway was open, it was declared obsolete. The Buffalo Convention Center, when it was opened, it was declared obsolete. They don't think in advance. They don't think down the road. The medical corridor and the medical campus, prime example. You've got all these people coming to Buffalo to attend medical school, to work in in Roswell and the medical campus and whatnot, but they have not thought about parking. Parking is a huge problem in the Fruit Belt near the medical campus now. They didn't build parking ramps. You've got property in the area where you could build parking ramps so that people could park. The problem is, what they've done is, a lot of the workers on the lower pay scales are taking up the spots on the streets in the Fruit Belt. And it's making it difficult for the residents in the Fruit Belt to park. If they move their cars during the day, by the time they get back, they have no parking spot. So it's a big problem. Buffalo has always had that problem. They don't think in the future as far as planning is concerned. And that's one of the prime areas that they need to be concerned with. They're always building something, but they're never thinking about parking.
I mean, here today in this city, they have more reason to have a disturbance than at any other period of time I can imagine. I mean, when you have the kind of homicide rates you have here in Buffalo, and then when you have where you build the construction industry is booming, but you don't see blacks on it. And it's gotten to the point where they accept it. Blacks accept it. And it's their fault at this juncture for accepting the fact instead of as historically we find that there have been people who said, look, you have to shut them down. If they come into your city and they start construction and not hiring black folks, shut the whole thing down. That's when you organize, you shut them down. You run them right out of business. Buffalo's a very quiet town. They don't do anything, to my knowledge, to get their fair share. Put it that way.
We have to learn from our mistakes. We have to learn from the positive things that came out of that, and we have to learn from the mistakes that we made. Again, I believe one of the biggest problems we had after that was that there was no follow-up. Because, again, there was probably not too much planning involved in that happening. But if anything like that happens, we need to be prepared to effect some sort of change. We need to be able to make sure that the people whose houses or buildings or whatever get damaged, are able to be repaid. Everything that we need to do should be planned first. Anything that we do should be planned first. There should be a plan B afterwards. I don't agree with rioting. I definitely don't agree with rioting in our own areas. It takes a village to raise a child, right? Everybody always says that. But then my next question is, if that village was to happen today, how would you govern that village? And we can't have a village governed under an anarchist rioting rule. We have to have some sort of structure. So in that vein, we learn from the past to make sure the future is right.
There is renewed interest on a 14-year-old case in Buffalo, New York, and it involves a former police officer who says she was fired in 2008 for stopping a white police officer's chokehold on a black suspect who was handcuffed.
You know, after George Floyd, people were like outraged. Like, why would those cops stand by and do nothing? And some people, whatever, they were like, remember that cop in Buffalo? She got fired.
Yeah.
And that's how this came all about. Again, it's always something that brings it about, but this really brought it about. And I had always wanted to figure out a way to solve the problem. And that is how it came up with Carrio's Law. Carrio's Law is a law that will hold police accountable. There will not ever be another George Floyd if there were other officers there to stop it. If we have Carrio's Law, because number one, it would be a duty to intervene, and there will be punishment if an officer did not intervene.